Happy December, friends. It's Michelle Myers here, and I wanted to answer a question that I've been asked a couple of different times already this season about the Santa Claus debate. Should Christians include him as a part of their holiday celebrations? Where does all of that come in? And first of all, let me say that I know people that fall on both sides of the equation to where they don't include Santa Claus in their family traditions, and I know families that do include Santa Claus in their family traditions. So I think, first of all, I just want to give a caveat and say, whatever your personal convictions are, God has given you those convictions for a reason, and personal convictions are exactly that. They're personal. And so if you are personally convicted that you should not include Santa Claus, then more power to you. I think that is fine. This video simply represents my thoughts and my feelings on including Santa Claus in our family traditions. So I want to go through 3 different areas where I think people struggle with Santa Claus and address those individually. First of all, Santa was real. Okay, so maybe not the guy that lives at the North Pole and comes down the chimney with a big bowl full of jelly for a belly, but St. Nicholas was a real person who allegedly, the folklore says, provided a dowry for 3 man's daughters so that they could get married and have healthy lives, among other good, kind deeds that he did. So by teaching them about Santa Claus, you are teaching them about a fictional character that was created based on a man that was real that did good, kind deeds. So that's my first thought in whether to include Santa Claus, is that who he is based on was a real man that did good and kind things. So I don't have a problem sharing that any more than I would tell a story about another man that did good and kind things who was a real person, because that's exactly who St. Nicholas was. So there are a lot of legends and folklore and things that are out there, and of course our society has twisted and created the fictional character thanks to poems and movies and tradition, but what it's based on, what Santa Claus is based on, is real. I think this is a great question. I think this is a valid question. But first, I want to ask, do you ask this question of yourself year-round? Does Jesus take priority over TV or sports, or insert whatever family activity or things that are important to you? Because the reality is, we shouldn't just ask this question at Christmas time. We should ask this question year-round. But specifically referring to Santa, I think that you can include Santa in the tradition without diminishing Jesus for 2 basic reasons. Number 1, Jesus shouldn't be someone that's just talked about in your family in December. And I'm going to venture to say that probably the rest of the year, Santa Claus doesn't get mentioned very much. So you can differentiate between the 2 for certain in December based on the fact that they know that Santa is kind of a short-term character in the household, whereas Jesus is a long-term figure that is discussed and talked about and learned about and praised and prayed to consistently throughout the year. So I think that there is definitely a seasonal difference between the 2. I think highlighting the characteristics of Santa that are similar to Jesus is important. Santa brings about the fact that giving is more important than receiving, which is a basic Christian principle, that we are to give and that we are to serve and that we are to love others and we are to be generous. So Santa has a trait that we can praise that goes along with the theology that they are learning along their lives. However, Santa gives gifts just to the good, whereas we can explain to our children that Jesus gives gifts to everyone if they accept him, if they believe in him. They get gifts. I'm sure that there are naughty kids who believe in Santa, who probably actually still get presents on Christmas morning, but that's another story for another day. But that's the principles. And so as long as you're having discussions with your kids that explain to them, this is this is Jesus's birth. This is the reason why we celebrate this. But Santa comes alongside it because he can teach, again, those important characteristics like generosity and giving and happiness and joy that we associate with Jesus, but teaching them the differences. So I think those are the main two things that you need to consider when you are wondering, how do I make sure that Jesus and Santa don't compete? Make sure that Jesus is a figure that is discussed all year round in your house, and that this is a priority that you set not only for December, but that you say, Jesus is number one in our household during football season. Jesus is number one in our household during whatever, to make sure that is consistent. But also making sure that you can teach them the similarities and the characteristics that Santa has that point towards Christ, and the ones where he's different and where Jesus is elevated and where Santa falls short, to where your kids are getting an educated view of how Jesus is more important than Santa, as well as just the emphasis that you put on it yourself. For example, I know that when we make gingerbread houses, we're going to do a nativity instead of just a gingerbread house. And that when we read books about Christmas, we are reading more books about Jesus's birth and the Christmas story, and doing Advent, we will be just reading random stories about Santa Claus and the night before Christmas and whatever. So if you need a suggestion for how you can work this in a daily basis in your household, is to find an Advent plan. I found a great one on Pinterest that uses the Jesus Storybook Bible, and we started it, and it has been fantastic. So, find those resources, but figure out how you can take the lead in your household and make sure that Jesus remains not only the reason for this season, but the reason, period, in your household and in your family. Again, this is where I really think personal convictions come into play. And so if you feel like you are lying to your children when you talk about Santa Claus and him coming down the chimney and sitting on his lap and he lives at the North Pole, then by all means, stick to the convictions that God has given you. Stick to those. But for me personally, I know that make-believe is a big part of Noah's world right now. I know that he takes an airplane and it around the house, and I'm not going to go, oh no, honey, sweetie, that's not a real airplane. You're not really flying that. Or if I had a daughter and we were having tea party and she served me air, I wouldn't go, sweetie, where's my tea? My cup is empty. I would sit there and I would drink it, and it would be the best air ever. So if you feel really strongly about lying to your kids, I just want to know where make-believe and where having an opportunity to step into their world comes into play. Because I can tell you that I boohoo watching my child at Disneyland, and it's just simply for the fact that I love the wonder that comes into his eyes when he gets to see these characters that he likes watching in cartoons in life. And it's like stepping into Mickey's world and stepping into Noah's world, because he loves those imaginative qualities. And so think about that, because Santa Claus is really no different than VeggieTales or the Chronicles of Narnia or anything along those lines that engages the child's imagination to get them thinking about spiritual things, if the parent approaches it correctly and make sure that they understand the underlying meaning behind it. So think about just the opportunity to step into your kids' world, because I keep being told, and I'm experiencing all too well, that kids grow up all too fast. And so for me, I really enjoy this time when Noah is little, when I can step into his world and I can be a part of it and capitalize on that excitement and imagination and creativity with him. Of course, the answer to the Santa Claus debate is not in the Bible, but I do want to offer this verse in closing that just is Colossians 4:5, where it talks about how we need to be wise in our interactions with outsiders and to make the most of every opportunity, and to make sure that our conversations are full of grace and seasoned with salt. so that we may know how to answer everyone. Colossians 4, 5, and 6. So if Santa Claus is someone that you decide not to include in your family traditions of Christmas, I still think that we have to be really careful the way that we address this with the world, to where they don't feel like we are attacking them if we don't agree with the way that they celebrate Christmas. No matter which side of the debate that you fall on, make sure that you don't let your personal convictions and your personal feelings about Santa Claus get in the way of someone else being able to see Jesus because they just see that you look down on them. And so I think that's probably the biggest issue, is not exactly our exact feelings on what we think about Santa Claus, but just how we handle the issue and how we handle it not only with other believers, but how we handle it with those that are outside of the Christian faith, to where they don't feel like they're being ostracized, or they feel like we feel that they're doing something wrong. So those are my personal convictions on Santa Claus, and I hope this video has been helpful to you, maybe to help you iron out some of your thoughts on how you handle the Christmas holidays. But from the Myers family to yours, have a very Merry Christmas, and I pray that we just all have a wonderful time celebrating that day 2,000 years ago that a little boy was born and changed the world.